Greetings and thank you for coming out this evening. I'm Dr. David Downing, the co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center, and we're happy to be the host of tonight's lecture and response on something with the margins, dreaming in the margins. His engagement with the Battle of Maldon. So appreciate your coming out. We know you have a busy semester, and sometimes when you're feeling daunted by looking at those paper deadlines, midterms, oral presentations, you can just take comfort in a 1,000-year-old poem, the lines that say, "Will shall be the stronger, heart the bolder, spirit the greater, as our strength lessens." So those are famous lines from the Battle of Maldon. In Paralandra, just as Ransom decides he has to do physical battle with the unmanned, it says he quoted a couple of lines from Maldon before he did, and we know which lines those were, I believe. So tonight we're going to talk about the Tolkien's engagement with the Battle of Maldon. And I see that we have 20% off in the bookshop if you want to buy your own copy of Tolkien's translation.
Tonight only.
Tonight only. In the next 5 minutes only. We're expressing urgency here. Okay, so let's, recently we got the results of a Wheaton job satisfaction survey. All the faculty and staff took it, and the highest score of any of the questions was 96%, which was the question that I believe that my Wheaton colleagues strive for excellence. That was the highest scoring question. And I certainly voted for a 5 out of 5 on that one because of colleagues like those that are here tonight. So we appreciate Benjamin Weber, Dr. Weber, to come tonight and talk about the Battle of Maldon. He has a BA from Princeton, MA and PhD from Cornell. He has a number of publications, including a book in progress called Woven in Words, Translations from Latin to Anglo-Saxon. And so that we're looking forward to that project. He's also teaching a number of classes on Old and Medieval English, and he's the faculty advisor to the Anglo-Saxon Club, the Old English Reading Group it's called. C.S. Lewis had a group called Beer and Beowulf, where they would get together and read Anglo-Saxon. So here at Wheaton, I believe that Benjamin is going for Coffee and Kenilworth. Is that what we're calling our club? Okay, Coffee and Kenilworth. And so he's going to talk about the poem, the translation, and the historical context. And then Dr. Jim Beitler will be a respondent.
Jim Beitler.
What did I say?
Bill.
No, I didn't. And tonight we have Ben and Jerry are going to be here sharing the ice cream. In any case, respondent also has a PhD from Michigan. You must have been happy about the end of the football season. There you go. Go Blue. Yeah. A number of books on rhetoric and Christianity. And he will be the Hanson Lecturer in 2026 talking about, is this a secret?
It's not a secret.
Just fantasy, social justice values as found in fantasy literature. So we're looking forward to both the presentation. I should have said that Benjamin will be opening his word hoard to talk about this. And then I should have said Jim will be trying to avoid overmode in terms of a humble response to these comments. Before we hear from our two speakers, we're going to have some members of the Tolkien Society, many of them recently released from jail, and they're going to come and give us an overview of the poem itself, the Battle of Maldon, and then we'll turn things over to Benjamin to talk about the poem and to James to give a response. And then Crystal will talk about some questions and answers. Okay. So let's welcome the students to give us an overview on the Battle of Maldon.
So, let me get this straight. You want to tell me about how your buddies in England fought the Vikings in the year 991, especially this guy, Beitler. And you say the story will really come to life, even though your manuscript is missing the beginning and the end. Also, you only speak Old English, so I have to use this dictionary.
Broken word.
I guess we're starting. Was broken. What is that supposed to mean? Shh.
Hold my horse, Patsy. Farewell, my hawk. It is time. Let us defend England against the Vikings.
Fair enough. Give us tribute and we'll leave you alone.
Oh, we'll give you tribute. In swords! Yeah! Guard the bridge.
This is bad. They've got the bridge and we can't cross it. What do we do?
I have a brilliant, devious strategy.
We will ask Beitler. Beitler,
What?
Will you please let us across?
She said please. Sure.
Why?
For his Overmode.
What does that mean? For his pride? For his overconfident chivalry? Because he was stuck up?
Oh. God, I thank you for all the good times. Please don't let the demons get my soul.
He's dead!
Now's my chance! I'm out of here! No! It's Beatles! Beatles, bleed! We're doomed!
Now we're doomed! Curse that Godric! Time to use our real courage!
For Vietnam!
Here shall the hedra, herteth the tenra,
Our minds must be stronger, our hearts bolder,
mode shall the mara, the uramayan butla.
and courage greater as our might lessens.
Goldrich!
Godric?
Nästa nasa Goldrich, that the Gula for there.
But that wasn't the Godric who fled? Is that where your manuscript ends? Come on! Well, that's all, folks.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that. Surprisingly accurate, actually. He said please is nowhere in the poem, but the rest of it is actually pretty easy to find. So let me echo Dr. Downing's thanks to all of you for coming to join us this evening, and add a few of my own. This evening's revels are possible thanks to the generosity, especially of the 4 different groups mentioned here, the Tolkien Society, the Wade Center in particular, Ms. Laura Stanifer, the Old English Reading Group, and the English Department, and I am deeply grateful to all of them. I think 3 of those groups are pretty familiar to all of you, but let me say a word about the 4th, this Old English Reading Group. And you can take a minute to admire the new logo, which was created by a sibling of one of our students. Someday I'm sure we will come up with a suitably epic foundation story to match that lovely new logo, but the real story is this. When I first came to Wheaton about 7 years ago in the halcyon days before the pandemic and many other things, I asked my very first medieval literature class if anyone just wanted to read some Old English texts in the original outside of class. A few brave souls said, yeah, of course. Where has this been all my life? And that was the beginning of the Old English Reading Group. After a couple semesters, we had roughed out a series of basic operating principles. We translate Old English texts slowly, using heavily glossed versions that I bring. We welcome everybody with no expectation of prior training in Old English or anything else. We meet on Friday afternoons from 3:30 to 4:30, and we have fun, spending most of our time on whatever text we're reading, but keeping ourselves free to consider various cultural and philological questions, like, why is the past tense of stride strode when the past tense of glide isn't glowed? It used to be, actually. Or how do early metalworking techniques relate to poetic descriptions of swords in Beowulf? A lot, we think. And if any of that piques your interest, students, now you know where to find us. It probably comes as no surprise that there's a significant overlap every year between the Tolkien Society and the Old English Reading Group. So when Peter Grabowskis' edition, and that's what provides us with all these lovely decorations, of Tolkien's translation of the Battle of Maldon, which you have just witnessed, one of the great poems of the Old English corpus. When that edition was published in the States last year, the stage was set for a meeting of the minds, and it really was the students in those two organizations who first expressed interest in an event of this sort. So of everybody I've got to acknowledge, I acknowledge none more gratefully than all of the students, both past and present, whose interest and hard work created the impetus for all of us to spend a little bit more time with Tolkien and the Old English poetic tradition. So with those acknowledgements made, confident now that you have at least a basic grasp of the story behind the Battle of Maldon, I want to say a couple words about my title, Dreaming in the Margins. I like it very much. It is both fitting and evocative. I wish it were original. It is not. I actually first encountered that phrase when I was doing research for an article on Beowulf, a piece in which Tolkien's The Monsters and the Critics played a significant role. I found the phrase at the very end of an article by a French scholar named André Crépin. The paper was called Beowulf, Monstre ou Modèle. You can probably work that one out for yourself. And at the end of his essay, Crépin allows himself some room to speculate about what Beowulf might have meant to different audiences during the Old English period. He acknowledges that this sort of speculation isn't necessarily what scholars are supposed to do, but he sees it as an inevitable result of committed reading. Imagination, he writes, on ne peut lire un chef-d'œuvre sans rêver dans ses marges. Fantasy, and I think there's a little perhaps but in here too. One can't read a masterpiece without dreaming in the margins. The funny thing about this story is that I agree with very little of what Crépin says about Beowulf. but I feel a deep kinship with his sense of what it is to read. To be a medievalist is in a certain way to make a career out of dreaming in the margins. Now, what sets Tolkien apart is that he managed to make not one career, but two. His marginal dreams brought him both to the top of his field as a scholar of Old English language and literature, and to remarkable success as a writer of fiction. I should say, though, that I'm not convinced Tolkien would agree with my assessment fully. In his writings, he often insists that his scholarship and his fiction aren't separate, but are different modes of investigating the same things. And so the same dreams that produced his public lectures and his work on the Battle of Maldon also produced The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, which is Tolkien's imaginative, dramatic reconstruction of the events following the battle that led to the poem's composition, and, as I'll suggest later, many other things besides. And so I've come to my theme, then, Tolkien's engagements, and the plural is deliberate, with the Battle of Maldon. I'll offer the same disclaimer here that I've offered in the past when commenting publicly on Tolkien's works. I am not actually a specialist in Tolkien. Dr. Downing, who introduced me, certainly is, and Dr. Beitler, who will be responding, him too. If I am an expert in anything, I am an expert in Old English language and literature, though I'm a little bit wary of applying that label to myself in the company of Tolkien. So I hope you will accept me as an interloping medievalist, someone who's blundered a bit like Grendel into the good cheer of the mead hall of Tolkien studies, and I will try not to break too many things on my way out. So in that spirit, I want to offer two propositions and one argument that I think will help to situate Tolkien's engagements with Maldon within the larger context of his readings of medieval literature, and to a lesser extent, given my lesser experience, his fiction. And I hope they will also prevent me from causing too much collateral damage. So first to my two propositions. I think these are relatively uncontroversial, and may be evident to some of you who have spent significant time with Tolkien, but in this context worth explicating. So here they are. First is that Tolkien's translation of Maldon, the one that Grabowskis has just published, was not his principal effort to work out his ideas about the poem, but it does contain some crucial evidence in the details. Proposition 2, that Tolkien's engagement with Maldon was carried out across a number of his works. The translation, yes, but also the homecoming and the essay called Overmode that attends it, Tolkien's scholarly work on Beowulf and the Gawain, and the Green Knight, and his fiction. These propositions, coupled with some additional evidence, will ultimately lead to my argument, which is that Tolkien's various engagements with Maldon show a consistent commitment to the notion that heroism is at once flawed and worthy of celebration. And I think that point of view is felt in his translation, understood from his commentary, and explored in his writing, particularly the Homecoming, but also, I think, some of his better-known works. I could put this argument a little bit differently and capitalize on my title by saying that the dreams Tolkien dreamed in the margins of Maldon helped give rise to a complex and kind of manifold inquest into the nature of heroism across his works. So what I'd like to do is to work my way through these propositions in service of that argument and hopefully along the way explore some of the philological, text critical, and historical byways that so animated Tolkien's own amble through the Middle Ages. So let me begin with this first proposition, that Tolkien's translation of Maldon, while significant, was not his principal effort to work out his ideas about the poem. Instead, I suspect it was his principal effort to work out his ideas about the poem's syntax, and to make sure he had an official translation prepared for his Oxford students who would hear his lectures on the poem in the course of preparing for one of Oxford's infamous exams. You really want to have all your ducks in a row in that system. Those of you who have taken a translation class of any sort know what I mean, right? So Manus in the Iliad isn't just wrath, but divine wrath. And pious, which is a favorite epithet for Aeneas in the Aeneid, means, unlike it does in unlike modern English piety, mindful of duty to both humans and gods. Part of Tolkien's job as a teacher, likewise, was to help his students, some of whom, perhaps many of whom, might not have had a deep acquaintance with Old English, to see that, for instance, Old English cold, I think here we are, yes. Cold, used to describe the river Blackwater, that river the Vikings crossed, because Beardnoth let them, in line 91, has the connotation of fatal, as in this first gloss, or that the Old English words Wehaga, Shieldburg, and Bordwell, literally battle hedge, shield fortress, and shield wall. I quite like the battle hedge, but shield fortress and shield wall all refer to a close order fighting formation in which warriors would touch their shields to hold ground against an enemy onslaught. Likewise, Tolkien's translation is scrupulously careful to work out the relationships between different phrases and clauses in the Old English, frequently in ways that are implied but not clearly spelled out by the original. Another reason I suspect the translation has this purpose is that Tolkien's choice of words often, though not always, seems to depend on the glosses provided by Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Reader, which was a well-known textbook which Tolkien himself used as a young man, and which he lectured on in 1926, which was 2 years before the first course of lectures on Maldon we know about. I actually have my own copy of Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Reader, albeit in a much later edition. Mine is the 15th. And certain idiosyncratic glosses stand out. So there is this poetic word Walwulfas used to describe the Vikings, which is glossed by Sweet as slaughterous wolves, which Tolkien then translates in his translation as murderous wolves. The gloss is actually pretty literal, but the word slaughterous stands out. The aforementioned Wehaga, right, the battle hedge, is glossed by Sweet as phalanx and translated the same way by Tolkien. But in both cases, Tolkien actually provides notes that expand upon Sweet's glosses. Tolkien's gloss on murderous wolves, for example, reads outcasts, outlaws, an idea he expands upon in a footnote by describing the heathen Vikings as, quote, enemies of all Christian men. It's useful to note here that Tolkien's gloss has a strong lexicographical and cultural basis. Outlaws and wolves are often associated in both Old Norse and Old English literature. In other words, this is just the sort of information a professor, especially a professor of a certain cast of mind, might want to provide as a supplement to a standard reading of a text. Wehaga, for instance, and you can see this here, right? Tolkien translates as phalanx, but he glosses as British square, which is an infantry formation that was used to protect against cavalry charges during the Napoleonic Wars, that then kind of becomes a symbol of British imperial supremacy during the 19th century. And you'll see that Tolkien actually cites the breaking of the British square as documented in one of Rudyard Kipling's poems. that talks about the Battle of Abu Klea in 1885. It's perhaps helpful to remember here that Tolkien served as an infantry officer in the Lancashire Fusiliers in the First World War, and he got his commission in 1915, so 30 years after the breaking of the square at Abu Klea. The terrible weapons of the First World War would have rendered the square obsolete tactically. An infantry square is not much use against machine guns and things. But as a symbol of heroic resistance against formidable odds, which is a virtue that clearly mattered to Tolkien, it may well have held on. So I would be happy to do this all night, but I think I've made my point, right? That Tolkien's translation of the Battle of Maldon reads very much like the sort of translation a professor would prepare to make sure that students working from a particular textbook had got all of the details worked out. His notes on the translation, likewise, seem to signal moments when he either disagreed with a reading in suite or felt it pedagogically useful to supplement the gloss or connect it somehow to his particular audience. British Square would likely have meant something to his audience of young men at Oxford in 1928 and 1930 that Battle Hedge, for all of its atavistic charm, did not. I would strengthen this claim with a final piece of evidence. Grabowskis notes, where is it? Yes, those are the notes. Yes, Grabowskis notes that the manuscript version of Tolkien's translation includes a somewhat smudged note in pencil that reads at the top, this something affair, something intended, something attempts to reproduce the poetic effect of the original. Remember, it's a prose translation. What you have below is my imaginative reconstruction of what that note really says along the lines Grabowskis outlines and thinking about Tolkien's tendency for self-deprecation in all of his writing. That this translation was not an attempt to reproduce the poetic effect of the original. I think that's probably right, and I'm thinking in particular of Tolkien's comment from his 1940 essay on translating Beowulf that the proper purpose of a prose translation is to provide an aid to study. Those of you who've read Grabowskis' volume and realize actually how much of Tolkien's interest in Maldon lay in his assessment of the poem's meter, the vast majority of that volume is devoted to metrical questions, will have even more reason to accept this point of view. All of this seems of a piece with the fact that Tolkien did not publish or attempt to publish the translation during his lifetime, and does not actually mention the translation itself in any of the letters that have been edited and indexed by Humphrey Carpenter and Christopher Tolkien. But if you look for Maldon in that book, what you will find is several mentions of the homecoming of Beorhtnoth, which is the play that Tolkien wrote, first in rhyme, then in an alliterative meter based on the meter of Beowulf and Maldon, about the recovery of Beorhtnoth's body from the battlefield. And as I move from the translation to the homecoming and sort of broaden my scope, I'm moving also to talk about the second of my propositions and kind of into my argument. So first, that Tolkien's engagement with Maldon spanned a very large number of works, and furthermore, that considering the translation of Maldon alongside those other works can help us revise some critical opinions about the homecoming and the view of heroism it expresses. It's probably important to note that The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth was first published in the journal Essays and Studies in 1953. So it is, among other things, a play published in an academic journal in the 1950s in England. It's an interesting thing for that reason, among others. The work was presented just as Grabowskis presents it. First, a short introduction to the historical context of Maldon, then a play in alliterative verse, chronicling this conversation between two of Beorhtnoth's lower class retainers, and then finally, an essay on the word Overmode, which you heard uttered before, a word which has, both before Tolkien and since, played an outsized role in scholarly discussions of Maldon. And in fact, if we take Tolkien at his word, The Homecoming itself is an essay on Overmode. He defends the piece's publication in Essays and Studies thus. You can see this piece, somewhat larger than the Old English fragment that inspired it, was composed primarily as verse, to be condemned or approved as such. This is a very Tolkien thing to say. Right? But to merit a place in Essays and Studies, it must, I suppose, contain, at least by implication, criticism of the matter and manner of the Old English poem, or of its critics. From that point of view, it may be said to be an extended comment on lines 89 and 90 of the original. Thus, Erla ongan for his overmode, a luven landes tofella, ladra theoda. Then the Earl, in his overmastering pride, actually yielded ground to the enemy, as he should not have done. Events that you saw before your very eyes. So, to pick up on something that I think was rightly emphasized in the play, Tolkien is pointing out that the poet here says that Byrhtnoth allowed the Vikings to cross this narrow causeway between the island on which they had landed and the southern bank of the Blackwater River for his Overmode. A phrase which has been translated in many ways with varying connotations of both blame and heroism. And actually the debate over how to translate this is very well represented, in my view, by the difference between Tolkien's 1953 translation and Overmode, what you have here, and what you find in the circa 1930. The date is uncertain, but that is when so approximately when we think he put this translation together, roughly contemporary with his lectures on Maldon. So that circa 1930 prose translation created likely for personal pedagogical use. To my ear and eye, the 1953 translation is much harsher. For my part, I would rather be accused of chivalry than pride. And Tolkien's choice to elide the too much, which is clearly present in the Old English, eliminates an ambiguity present in both the Old English and Tolkien's earlier translation. It isn't clear whether the poem criticizes Byrhtnoth for allowing the Vikings to cross the land bridge at all, or whether it criticizes him for giving too much ground away as part of what might have been an otherwise reasonable tactical decision. I should probably expand upon that second point, admitting that I am not no great tactician myself, especially when it comes to battle hedges and spears. It may seem intuitively obvious that one should not let Vikings cross easily defensible land bridges in order to bring their full weight of numbers to bear on one's troops. However, experts reassure me that things may have not been so simple. So Richard Abels, who is a great military historian of the period, wrote a very cogent and well-reasoned essay on Maldon in which he points out that Viking raiders were highly mobile thanks to their ships. And if Byrhtnoth refused to yield any ground, so penning them on Northey Island, the raiders could pretty easily get back on their ships, outsail the Earl's army, and then just attack some undefended area in Essex. Byrhtnoth is the ealdorman of the county of Essex and therefore responsible for the defense of the whole thing. And so by bringing them to battle, he may have hoped to wipe out the threat once and for all, rather than kick an agile, mobile, and hostile can down the road. As corroborating evidence, and this is the sort of evidence I like, Abels points out the successful use of the tactic at a battle at Wensfield in 909 or 910, as recorded in Ethelward's Chronicle. If we look at the poem from this perspective, we might see Byrhtnoth's error as a failure primarily of tactical judgment. His approach could have been reasonable, but he had too much confidence in his army's ability to hold against the Vikings, and so he gave up too much ground, which allowed them to concentrate too much force against his battle hedge. I think it's clear, regardless of which option you choose, the poem assigns a failure of judgment to Byrhtnoth, but the precise nature of that failure is unclear to us, though it may or may not have been to the poem's original audience. Tolkien's prose translation preserves the ambiguity, but his discussion in Overmode seems to come down very, very strongly on one side of the question. So it appears, at least. And that's how his argument has largely been presented by Tolkien scholars, and particularly Tom Shippey, who I think is the loudest voice in this conversation. What I'd like to suggest tonight, and now I'm really coming to the heart of my argument, is that Tolkien's earlier prose translation is a salutary reminder to explore the complexity of Tolkien's views on heroism in Maldon, both in The Homecoming and in connection to his other works. I grant you that that is a large job, and our time is not infinite. I will confine myself tonight to two texts. The first is The Homecoming itself, and then the second is a couple moments from The Two Towers. And I have brought my childhood copy of The Two Towers with me tonight. I don't know what to say about the cover art, but it's a cherished book for many reasons. So let me begin with The Homecoming, and with critical assessments of that work. In the often quoted section of the essay on Overmode that is appended to the play, Tolkien argues that this phrase that we've been batting around, right, for his Overmode, suggests, quote, severe criticism. and that we need to see the severity of that criticism in order to appreciate fully the heroism shown by Byrhtnoth's loyal retainers, cut down, to the very last person standing while they fought to avenge their lord against the Viking host. And this is what he writes. His study of the behavior of the Heroism, and that's Byrhtnoth's closest companions, his hearth companions, lacks the sharpness and tragic quality that he intended if his criticism is not fully valued. By it, the loyalty of the retinue is greatly enhanced. Their part was to endure and die, and not to question, though a recording poet may fairly comment that someone had blundered. In their situation, heroism was superb. Their duty was unimpaired by the error of their master, and, more poignantly, neither in the hearts of those near to the old man was love lessened. It is the heroism of obedience and love, not of pride or willfulness, that is the most heroic and most moving. From Wiolaf under his kinsman's shield, to Bertwald at Maldon, down to Balaclava, even if it is enshrined in verse no better than the charge of the light. I'm a big Tennyson fan. It hurts me to read this, and I'm stuck to go on. Yeah. But that, I suppose, was his opinion, to which he is entitled. So this passage, or at least selections from it, is often cited along Tolkien's translation of lines 89 and 90 of Maldon in the essay, the one I just showed you, as evidence that Maldon sort of pushed Tolkien towards an abandonment of the Northern heroic spirit as essentially incompatible with a Christian perspective. This is particularly the view of Tom Shippey, who has made his case in a series of articles on Maldon and the Homecoming. In his essay Heroes and Heroism, Tolkien's Problems, Tolkien's Solutions, Shippey writes this: "The true heroic spirit Tolkien knew was founded on, quote, the creed of the unyielding will, and on a fundamental lack of hope, and was unavailable, at least in theory, to the Christian who is not allowed to lose hope." This essential idea, that Tolkien found himself irresistibly drawn to something conscience forbade him from believing, permeates Shippey's work on the issue. It inflects his reading of the Homecoming, as well as his understanding of heroism in Middle-earth. Later in the same essay, Shippey writes that, quote, Tolkien's problem as regards the heroic literature of antiquity was, I would say, on the one hand, a great professional liking, and on the other, an extreme ideological aversion. What was the solution? Simply to try again and again to reconcile them. Now, Tom Shippey is one of the great readers of Tolkien, and so one challenges him, only with humility and no small degree of trepidation, remembering that Overmode can afflict scholars, as well as soldiers. Even so, I am not sure that this is the best way to read The Homecoming or The Lord of the Rings. What Tolkien's translation encourages us to see, I think, is that his genuine admiration of the sort of heroism one finds in Maldon and Beowulf was always tempered by the awareness that human beings, flawed and sinful as we are, inevitably mix selfish motives into otherwise pure things. Tolkien gives the mixture a name. The name is chivalry. This is what he writes. For this northern heroic spirit is never quite pure. It is of gold and an alloy. Unalloyed, it would direct a man to endure even death unflinching when necessary. That is, when death may help in the achievement of some object of will, or when life can only be purchased by denial of what one stands for. But since such conduct is held admirable, the alloy of personal good name was never wholly absent. Yet this element of pride, in the form of the desire for honor and glory, in life and after death, tends to grow, to become a chief motive, driving a man beyond the bleak heroic necessity to excess, to chivalry. Excess, certainly, even if it be approved by contemporary opinion, when it not only goes beyond need and duty, but interferes with it. I think unpacking Tolkien's metaphor here helps to make my point. The northern heroic spirit is the gold of unflinching courage alloyed with an impure desire for fame. Tolkien doesn't seem to challenge the value of courage or heroism in itself, but accepts that in a fallen world, self-regard always creeps in, urging those with great capabilities to excess, sometimes with fatal results. I don't see in either of the passages I've just cited an argument in favor of rejecting heroism or a justification for Shippey's claim that Tolkien, quote, did not like, and those are his words, the moving words of Bertwald, quoted earlier by our performers, right? He shall the herdra, hert the kenra, mod shall the mara, the uramayan, lutlith. Mine must be the harder, heart the keener, courage the greater, as our might dwindles. I would argue instead that Tolkien liked them very much. but that he also recognized the paradox of heroism offered up by the anonymous poet of the Battle of Maldon. Heroism is always worthy of both praise and blame, insofar as it is always both selfless and self-interested. I would suggest that Tolkien's work presents that notion less as a problem to be solved and more as a truth to be recognized. Let me then take some care in defending that suggestion along the lines I suggested earlier, and beginning with the homecoming. The homecoming, I think, is a good place to start for two reasons. First, as you've seen, Tolkien himself described it as a comment on lines 89 and 90 of Maldon. And second is that the homecoming looms very large in Shippey's arguments about Tolkien's view on heroism. As I've already mentioned, the homecoming tells the story of two peasants. Their names are Torthelm and Tidwald, who are sent to retrieve Byrhtnoth's body in the aftermath of the battle to recover it so it can be buried. Tidwald, whose name means something like Time Warden, tempted to translate it as Time Lord, but that's a little... It's both not quite right and evokes the wrong sorts of things. Tidwald is old, and he regards the Old English heroic tradition with a skeptical eye. Torthelm, Bright Helmet is his name, is much younger, and he has a head and a heart full of old songs and stories. Tolkien later intimates in The Homecoming that Torthelm may actually sort of go on to become the poet who composed the Battle of Maldon. When the two reach the causeway between Northey and the bank of the Blackwater, they pause to consider why there are so few dead Vikings on the causeway itself, and all the casualties instead are on the bank. This is what they say. Torthelm, he's the dreamer, right? The young idealistic dreamer, after a pause. It's strange to me how they came across this causeway here, or forced a passage without fierce battle. You hear the alliterative verse coming out. But there are few tokens to tell of fighting. A hill of heathens one would hope to find, but none lie near. Tidwald replies, "No more's the pity. Alas, my friend, our lord was at fault. Or so in Maldon this morning, men were saying, too proud, too princely, but his pride's cheated, and his princedom past, so we'll praise his valor. He let them cross the causeway, so keen was he, to give minstrels matter for mighty songs, needlessly noble, it should never have been, bidding bows be still, and the bridge opening, matching more with few in mad hand strokes, well, doom he dared, and died for it." At this moment, Tidwald clearly expresses Tolkien's criticism of Byrhtnoth from that essay, Overmode. Chivalry is excess. Byrhtnoth's desire for glory doomed both himself and his soldiers. Shippey takes this passage, Tidwald's speech here, as a definitive expression of Tolkien's view on Maldon, dismissing Torthelm as simply a stooge. Those are Shippey's words again. I would begin by pointing actually towards a certain ambiguity in Tidwald's comment in the middle of the speech here, when he says that his pride's cheated and his princedom past, so we'll praise his valor. What does it mean? Let's not speak ill of the dead is one possibility. But another, more attractive to me, is that Tidwald here expresses an idea that I think mattered quite a bit to Tolkien, and that is this. After all considerations of glory, wisdom, and so on are set aside, the simple fact of courage still matters. That reading helps to make sense of a moment slightly earlier in the play, one on which Shippey doesn't comment, when Torthelm praises Byrhtnoth in a fine heroic style, and Tidwald, despite his usual grumpiness at Torthelm's excesses, replies, "Brave words, my lad. The woven staves have yet worth in them for woeful hearts." Even Tidwald, old and world-weary, finds some consolation in Torthelm's compositions. Consolation is not a word that I use capriciously, for those of you who have read the essay. The point I'm trying to make here in reference to the homecoming is that Tolkien leaves aside the monologic form of the lecture or academic article in Overmode for a dialogic exploration of the same problem. And drama is really good at dialogic explorations of things. That's one of the reasons we love it. And in that dialogic exploration, Torthelm is actually able to defend Byrhtnoth's heroism and legacy more fully than Tolkien does ex cathedra professoris in Overmode. I think the back and forth between Tidwald and Torthelm in the play mirrors the back and forth between Tolkien's two translations of those key lines from Maldon. One is a harsh and direct criticism of Byrhtnoth's failure. The other is tempered by a love and respect for Byrhtnoth's heroism. Overmode makes a clear argument, according to the customs of academic discourse, allegiance to which was the price of admission to essays and studies, as Tolkien himself sort of wryly comments upon. But the play itself offers, I think, a less clear but also a rounder view, and perhaps one that was a bit closer to Tolkien's heart. As a final piece of evidence, I would adduce a scene from The Lord of the Rings that seems germane, and that is the death of Boromir at the beginning of The Two Towers. So I am not the first to make this comparison, but I do have some new things to say about it. So Lynn Forrest Hill has commented on this scene in connection to Maldon, but I think she comes at it more or less through a Shippian lens. She understands Boromir's attempt to take the ring and his subsequent death as a tale of sin and redemption, right? He sort of buys his way out of guilt by an heroic sacrifice. In light of the argument I've just laid out, I see it a bit differently. Like Beartnoth, Boromir is a hero who makes a serious mistake and pays the price for it, and he does not pay the price for it alone. The error is unequivocally an error, and it is moralized and even spiritualized in The Lord of the Rings as it is not in Maldon. It's clear that Boromir's desire to take and use the ring arises from an excessive self-regard, but Boromir's selfless defense of the hobbits is the gold in the alloy. And as we look at the subsequent reactions to Boromir's death, I think we see something very similar to the way that Tolkien treated Maldon in his two translations, and also to the way that Torthelm and Tidwald treat Beartnoth in The Homecoming. That once again, Tolkien reaches for the dialogic, offering up a series of reminiscences that neither excuse Boromir's error nor question his heroism, and I don't think we're meant to see the two as separable. I've said many things. Let me show you what I mean. As you likely know, we don't actually see Boromir's last stand in The Lord of the Rings. In the first chapter of The Two Towers, which is entitled The Departure of Boromir, itself an interesting parallel to The Homecoming of Beartnoth, Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn come upon Boromir mortally wounded after the battle's end. Boromir confesses to Aragorn that he had tried to take the ring from Frodo before he says his final... sorry, those are important too. Before he says his final goodbye. Farewell, Aragorn. Go to Minas Tirith and save my people. I have failed. No, said Aragorn, taking his hand and kissing his brow. You have conquered. Few have gained such a victory. Be at peace. Minas Tirith shall not fall. Boromir smiled. Which way did they go? Was Frodo there? Said Aragorn. But Boromir did not speak again. Alas, said Aragorn, thus passes the heir of Denethor, Lord of the Tower Guard. Forest Hill sees this as a scene of confession and absolution, with Aragorn playing the role of the priest. I think there's justice in that reading. I wouldn't want to reject it. But I do feel that the details that follow maybe point us towards a slightly different or fuller understanding of Aragorn's role here. Just after these lines, the three companions bury Boromir. And it's a very Anglo-Saxon sounding burial. Legolas actually laments that they can't raise a mound over Boromir, and so they opt for a burial at sea. So those of you who've read Beowulf, Shieldshifting's funeral, the mound at the end, all this stuff is very familiar. So the companions place Boromir in one of the elven boats with his weapons and his war gear, along with those of his defeated foes. And again, think of them, loading up the ship at the beginning of Beowulf to send Shieldshifting off. And they send the boat down the river to be carried over Rorris Falls to the sea. And if you want some textual connections between The Lord of the Rings and Maldon and The Homecoming, they are there. So on page 21, the companions build a litter with which they can drag Boromir to one of the elven boats along the shore, just as Beartnoth is carried on a wagon in The Homecoming and brought by boat to Ely, which is an island. Both The Homecoming and the chapter end with voices echoing over the water as a way to sort of send off the departed hero. In The Lord of the Rings, the journey to the boat is tough going, we're told, because Boromir was a man both tall and strong. One of the details that Tolkien shares with his readers about Beartnoth in the introduction to The Homecoming is that Beartnoth was exceptionally tall. His footnote says 6'9", according to one estimate. And I should add that the estimate is almost certainly false. There's a really good essay on it in the Millennial edition of Battle of Maldon that sort of explains where does this kind of myth of Beartnoth's massive height come from. And so 6'9" is ambitious. He is called large-bodied, or it said that he has a large-body corpora magno in the Liber Eliensis, which is a sort of half cartulary, half chronicle that Ely Cathedral has. It's significantly later than the Old English poem, but that phrase appears in parallel to a number of other phrases that sound very much sort of like stock praises of someone who was actually a really important benefactor of Ely. So Beartnoth donated a lot of land to Ely. And so finding a sort of florid Latin praise of him in the cartulary is not perhaps the most shocking thing. But to Tolkien, this is an important detail, and despite the fact that he's perfectly willing to pour cold water on some details in the Liber Eliensis, this one he cites without any comment. Tydwald, in The Homecoming, actually remarks on Beartnoth's height early in the play and later then complains about how heavy the body is to carry. But I think even more germane to my point is what follows. Once Boromir has been sent on his way, Aragorn and Legolas sing a song in his honor. It's not an alliterative verse, it's in rhyming couplets, but it combines a lament for Boromir's death with praise of his bravery in the battle that took his life. As in the scene I read before, we find no mention of Boromir's mistake. What his companions choose to remember after his death is his heroism, finding consolation in their ability to weave staves to tell their departed companion's story. I thus see Aragorn here as less of a priest and more of a fellow hero, memorializing Boromir and the heroism for which he stood in lines not entirely unlike Beorhtwald's in the Battle of Maldon. But as I said, Boromir, like Maldon and Beartnoth, gets the dialogic treatment. If Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli, Gimli doesn't sing, but he's there. If Aragorn and Legolas take Torthelm's part in eulogizing Boromir, Tydwald's more skeptical posture is assigned much later in the novel to Faramir. In the chapter titled The Window on the West, Frodo and Sam meet Faramir in the course of their journey towards Mordor. After quite a bit of distrust on both sides, Faramir reveals that Boromir has died, and he shares some of his suspicions about the Fellowship's quest. He says, "What in truth this thing is, I cannot yet guess. But some heirloom of power and peril it must be, a fell weapon, perchance, devised by the Dark Lord. If it were a thing that gave advantage in battle, I can well believe that Boromir, the proud and fearless, often rash, ever anxious for the glory of Minas Tirith and his own glory therein, might desire such a thing and be allured by it. Alas, that ever he went on that errand. I should have been chosen by my father and the elders, but he put himself forward as being the older and hardier, both true, and he would not be stayed." Faramir's comments about Boromir here very much echo Tydwald's comments about Beartnoth in The Homecoming and Tolkien's in Overmode. Though they are respectful of Boromir's heroism and they are not uttered without love, Faramir laments that Boromir's sense of duty to Minas Tirith is entangled with his desire for personal glory. Boromir, it seems, has fallen prey to chivalry. And in the world of The Lord of the Rings, chivalry is a weakness the enemy can exploit. As I've already mentioned, the ring actually exploits Boromir's self-regard to attempt to sort of seduce him by filling his mind's eye with visions of personal glory in the Fellowship. One of the difficulties in writing about this scene is that, or writing about Boromir's death, is it's sort of split over the Fellowship and the Two Towers, right? You can jump back and forth. And I will add as an aside that if anybody is looking for an interesting research topic on Tolkien, chivalry it is a really interesting one. Why it means what it means to him, how he engages with it in some of the Arthurian material, a whole host of other questions I think come out of this line of inquiry. One laments the fact that there is no concordance of Tolkien's works like there is of Shakespeare's or Spenser's or Virgil's, and one could simply find every occurrence of the word chivalry, but perhaps someday, right? So this brings me to the final point that I want to make. That lines 89 to 90 of the Battle of Maldon seem to have inspired Tolkien quite a bit, not only in The Homecoming, but in his larger interest in heroism and its poor cousin chivalry in The Lord of the Rings. In all three cases, Tolkien refuses to offer a simple vision of heroism. He consistently depicts it as alloyed gold, not separable by anyone, pagan or Christian, so long as humankind is what it is. Tolkien's works are, I think, suffused with the feeling expressed by Beorhtwald in lines 312 to 313 in Maldon. As time goes on and our strength, individual and collective, lessens, courage only becomes more worth remembering. And that desire to remember is not, pace shippy, wholly without hope. And I'm thinking here of the very end of the homecoming, when the monks of Ely are chanting the Latin Office of the Dead over Beirtnoth's body as their voices echo over the water upon which some men are rowing. Do I have that here? No, I do not. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum, dirige Domine in conspectu tuo viam meam. Glory to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, and is, and will be, always, through an age of ages. Direct, O Lord, my way in your sight. While the words of the Latin are a eulogy for Beirtnoth, they seem to me to be also a eulogy for the age of heroes. A lament in borrowed words that even alloyed heroism is rarely found these days. At the same time, the office's final prayer, which I just read to you, reminds us that true glory is not bounded by time. It was and is and will be through an age of ages, world without end. I would conclude my talk by suggesting that Tolkien found in the Battle of Maldon a small, partial, alloyed, nonetheless potent reminder of what real glory, truly timeless glory, wholly unalloyed with selfish desire, might look like. I think it is that dream, perhaps first conceived when Tolkien was a young man reading the Battle of Maldon, before he went to war or became a professor, wrote for publication, that animated so much of what he did with Maldon and with many other things later in his life. Thank you.
How great was that? Thank you. Thanks to all the groups Dr. Weber mentioned at the beginning of his talk, especially to Dr. Weber himself for inviting me to be part of this festive occasion. It's a proper Tolkien moot, I would say. But I'm going to begin with a very strong objection. Dr. Weber, you began by describing yourself as an interloping medievalist in the Mead Hall of Tolkien Studies, and all evidence to the contrary. My friend, I would counter tonight that you've not been an interloper, but the host of a banquet, treating us to a hearty dish of Tolkien Studies fare. I think we've got both supper and dinner in the same meal in Hobbit speak. So, that said, Dr. Weber's comments about expertise and his own perceived limitations at the beginning of the talk are instructive, especially given the subject of the talk. As he noted, overmastering pride is a vice known to tempt not only Anglo-Saxon warriors, but Anglo-Saxon scholars, and in fact, all scholars as well. And as he has consistently done during his time at Wheaton, Dr. Weber has modeled for us how to avoid this danger tonight. The beginning of his talk actually reminded me of someone. Here's how Tolkien himself begins his justifiably famous lecture-turned-essay on fairy stories. I propose to speak about fairy stories, though I am aware this is a rash adventure. Fairy's a perilous land, and in it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. And overbold I may be accounted, for though I have been a lover of fairy stories since I learned to read, and have at times thought about them, I have not studied them professionally. Tolkien is careful to acknowledge the limits of his expertise. When it comes to the genre of the fairy story, he's not a professional, but a lover, an amateur of the genre. And in writing about fairy stories, Tolkien brings his professional expertise as a philologist to something he loves, the fairy story, in order to speak insightfully about the topic. Tonight, Dr. Weber has brought his expertise as a medievalist to something he loves, Tolkien's translation, to speak very insightfully about the topic. All that to say, in terms of the way you've approached your talk, you're in good company. There's actually another reason I read you the opening of On Fairy Stories, though. Did you hear it? It was Tolkien's use of the word overbold. That sounds familiar. Instead of critiquing Dr. Weber's argument tonight, I plan to extend it by simply offering you 3 brief examples that show that the dialogue about heroism and Overmode continues not only in the scene with Boromir, but throughout Tolkien's legendarium. At the end, I'm going to return to the beginning of On Fairy Stories and Tolkien's claim that he himself might be accounted as overbold. Okay, example 1, Beren and Luthien. Our first example from the Silmarillion comes from a story that was near and dear to Tolkien. Indeed, he wrote and rewrote it. And as you probably know, the names Beren and Luthien are inscribed underneath his and Edith's names on their gravestone. To make a long and at times very weird story short, Beren and Luthien loved each other, but Beren was told by Luthien's father that he could only marry her on one condition. He had to steal one of 3 Silmarils, those great jewels that are at the heart of the saga of the Silmarillion, from Big Baddie Morgoth's Iron Crown. Eventually, Beren and Luthien make it to Morgoth's fortress. Beren disguises himself as a wolf, and as they approach Morgoth's throne, Luthien sings a song of surpassing loveliness and blinding power, causing Morgoth, and really everybody else, to fall into a deep, dark sleep. Let's pick it up there. Then her, Luthien's voice, came dropping down like rain into pools, profound and dark. She cast her cloak before his, Morgoth's, eyes, and set upon him a dream, dark as the outer void where he had once walked. Suddenly he fell, as a hill sliding an avalanche, and hurled like thunder from his throne, lay prone on the floors of hell. The iron crown rolled from his head. All things were still. As a dead beast, Beren lay upon the ground, but Luthien, touching him with her hand, aroused him, and he cast aside his wolf-hame. Then he drew forth his knife, Angrist, and from the iron claws that held it, he cut a Silmaril. As he closed it in his hand, the radiance welled through his living flesh, and his hand became a shining lamp. But the jewel suffered his touch and hurt him not. Now here's the important part. It came then into Beren's mind that he would go beyond his vow to Luthien's father and bear out of Angband all 3 of the jewels of Fëanor. But such was not the doom of the Silmarils. The knife Angrist snapped, and a shard of the blade flying smote the cheek of Morgoth. Whoops. He groaned and stirred, and all the host of Angband moved in sleep. Then terror fell upon Beren and Luthien. Beren, the character's name who Tolkien had carved into his own gravestone, suffered from overmastering pride in trying to take a second Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. He tries to go beyond his vow. That's the exact language Tolkien uses in the Overmode essay, actually. An excess of heroism. It's chivalry. He wants the glory of being the one to bear not 1 but 3 Silmarils out of Angband, and that puts Luthien at risk, the same way the warriors are put at risk in the Battle of Maldon. And there's a lot more to say about Overmode and the Silmarils and the fall of the elves, especially as it relates to Tolkien's pride in his own myth-making. But time is brief, so if you want to know more, ask me sometime about the Oath of Fëanor. Okay, that's all you get. Example 2, the Black Gate. Okay, we're going to fast forward now, a lot, to the final battle with Sauron's army in The Lord of the Rings. So you'll remember Frodo and Sam are struggling to reach the cracks of doom with the ring. Meanwhile, Aragorn, Gandalf, and some other lords are deciding on their next move. Recall that the number of Aragorn's forces, together with those of his allies, are meager compared to those of Sauron. Now here's Gandalf, a military strategist at this point, speaking to Aragorn and the other lords. This then is my counsel. We have not the ring. In wisdom or great folly, it has been sent away to be destroyed, lest it destroy us. Without it, we cannot by force defeat his force, but we must at all costs keep his eye from his true peril. We cannot achieve victory by arms, but by arms we can give the ring bearer his only chance, frail though it be. As Aragorn has begun, so we must go on. We must push Sauron to his last throw. We must call out his hidden strength, so he shall empty his land. We must march out to meet him at once. We must make ourselves the bait, though his jaws should close on us. He will take the bait, in hope and in greed. And this is the important part. For he will think that in such rashness he sees the pride of the new ring lord. And he will say, so, he pushes out his neck too soon and too far. Let him come on. And behold, I will have him in a trap from which he cannot escape. There I will crush him, and what he has taken in his insolence shall be mine again forever. Through the ring, Sauron tempts people to overmastering pride. And that's what he's expecting from Aragorn. But the sin to which Sauron tempts others is his own downfall. In his own pride, he can't imagine that the ring would be given to a lowly hobbit in order to be destroyed. And Gandalf knows all this. And so, at the Black Gate, Gandalf and Aragorn pretend to be suffering from overmastering pride, from Overmode. They act as if they have the, quote, pride of the new ring lord, in the hopes of playing on Sauron's own pride. As a military strategist, it's almost as if Gandalf has carefully studied the Battle of Maldon. Example 3, on Mount Doom. Meanwhile, Frodo and Sam have, against all odds, made it to the crack of doom. And here we go. The light sprang up, and there on the brink of the chasm, at the very crack of doom, stood Frodo, black against the glare, tense, erect, but still as if he had been turned to stone. Master, cried Sam. Then Frodo stirred and spoke with a clear voice. Indeed, with a voice clearer and more powerful than Sam had ever heard him use, and it rose above the throb and turmoil of Mount Doom, ringing in the roof and walls. I have come, he said, but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine. And suddenly he set it on his finger and he vanished from Sam's sight. Frodo has finally been overmastered by greed and pride. The ring is his. He will be, he thinks, the new Lord of the Rings. Now, fortunately, of course, there are other forces at work in this world besides that of evil, says Gandalf. And it's Gollum who, in some ways, saves the day. But Frodo is undoubtedly proud in this moment. And like the warriors at the Battle of Maldon, puts those he loves most deeply, perhaps, at risk. Sam. Okay, so let's pause here and consider Frodo's heroism. Dr. Weber showed us that Boromir's heroism was still recognized by the other characters despite his pride, despite his chivalry. Can we say the same about Frodo? Can we forgive his greed and his overmastering pride? Now, many scholars have written on Frodo's heroism or lack thereof. But let's go straight to the source and hear from Tolkien himself on the subject. And this is from his letters. Here's one letter. Frodo indeed failed as a hero. Failed as a hero, as conceived by simple minds. He goes on. He did not endure to the end. I do not say simple-minded with contempt. They often see with clarity the simple truth and the absolute ideal to which effort must be directed, even if it is unattainable. Their weakness, however, is twofold. They do not perceive the complexity of any given situation in time in which the absolute ideal is enmeshed. They tend to forget that strange element in the world that we call pity or mercy, which is also an absolute requirement in moral judgment since it's present in the divine nature. Tolkien realizes that moral situations are always complex, and in a manner analogous to the character's reactions to Boromir, is willing to forgive Frodo of his pride and recognize the honor due to him for what he did accomplish. He writes as much elsewhere. This is what he says in his another letter. Frodo deserved all honor because he spent every drop of his power of will and body, and that was just sufficient to bring him to the destined point and no further. So we can praise Frodo as a hero. Then he says, the other power took over then, the writer of the story. And by that, I don't mean myself. Frodo did as much as possible, and then by the providence of Eru Ilúvatar, God, the quest was completed. So Tolkien is able to recognize Frodo as a hero. Okay, that's all well and good for Tolkien's literary characters, but what about for literary critics? It's clear that Tolkien understood overmastering pride as a danger not just for thanes and lords, but for critics and readers. Prideful readers frequently use text to their own ends, and in the process, they often tear those texts to pieces. You're probably familiar with Tolkien's wonderful metaphor for bad criticism from his essay Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, but it's so good that it's worth hearing one more time. Here it is. A man inherited a field in which was the accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in building the house in which he lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. But his friends, it's not in quotes, but I'm putting it in quotes, his friends coming perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor. And in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it and forgot even the stones. They all said, "This tower is most interesting." But they also said, after pushing it over, "What a muddle it's all in." And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, "He is such an odd fellow. Imagine using these old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did not he restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion." But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look upon the sea. Unwilling to submit to and see with the text, readers suffering from overmastering pride tear down what they're trying to study for their own glory. Okay, but, and this is an important point, there's a difference between suffering from overmastering pride and being overbold. If you'll remember, at the beginning of On Fairy Stories, Tolkien says that dungeons await those overbold to speak about fairy stories. But then he goes ahead and speaks about it. And he says, "Overbold I may be accounted." And in his Overmode essay, he says that overmode should not be translated as overbold in a footnote. So overbold can be okay at times. When might overbold scholarship be appropriate? I think we have an answer to this question in one of the lines that Dr. Weber read for us from his essay on Overmode. This is what Tolkien writes. "It's the heroism of obedience and love, not of pride or willfulness, that is the most moving and the most heroic." Let me swap out a few words there. It is the scholarship of obedience and love, not of pride and willfulness, that is the most illuminating and the most moving. When literary study is done not out of excessive pride, but out of a deep love for its subject, as Dr. Weber has done tonight, and faithfully does with the Old English Reading Group each Friday afternoon, such overboldness deserves to be commended and deserves our gratitude. And with that, will you please thank Dr. Weber again.
Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions if anybody would like to ask either of our wonderful professors here.
We can, yeah.
Okay, good idea.
Sure. Don't need to hide in the corner.
Any questions?
Well, just a comment first upon the commentary. It's always seemed to me that Frodo was not falling to his pride at Mount Doom, but he had come as far as he could, as Tolkien said, and he was overcome by something, the ring, that was evil in itself and more powerful. I mean, that's just my impression of it. But I guess what I wanted to ask about is if Dr. Weber could make a comment or a contrast or compare someone who seems to be 180 degrees away from Berenoth, and that's Farmer Giles of Ham. I mean, here's a character who is not overbold, but he's cunning and daring when he needs to be, and the whole tone of that story is more humorous as opposed to the fateful sense of doom that's perhaps in the Battle of Maldon, and Farmer Giles is the beginning of something, and this is the end of something. But if you had any comments about those two characters created by the same author.
I shall marshal my forces. I don't certainly have extensive comments about Farmer Giles because I've not thought about him as much as Byrhtnoth or Boromir. But I'm happy to hold forth to the extent that I can. Overbold, but hopefully not afflicted by overmode. Yeah. So I think that Tolkien's interest in sort of what it is to be a hero is something that sort of pervades his work, and this is not an original thought. This is well documented, I think, by a lot of folks, and I feel also that a lot of his attempts to wrestle with Old English poetry, and this is, I'm speaking maybe more from my convictions as a fellow reader than anything else, are attempts to sort of put a finger on or to give a local habitation and a name to something that he feels intuitively is very important but isn't quite sure how to describe. And some of the frustration that one feels in his addresses to his fellow scholars at Oxford, who sort of criticize him for not having done more with his chairs, why didn't you publish more, or whatever it is, comes from the fact that they don't get that what he's after is so very important. And so I say that just because I think that the challenge, right, that effort of sort of capturing something that isn't for him easily capturable or explicable lies behind the fact that you get sort of so many different characters whom we can say are heroic in their own ways or in different ways, but kind of collectively cover, I mean, you said 180 degrees, right? Like a pretty broad spectrum of possibilities. And I recognize that that's a pretty general answer, and I wish I had a much more specific one, but there it is. But if you have any.
I thought that was great.
I was wondering, microphone. I was wondering, you were talking about the Black Gate, specifically Dr. Beitler was, as an example of Tolkien's contrast between heroism and chivalry. And I was wondering if either of you thought that Aragorn's decision to let those who didn't want to go to the Black Gate to turn back without being seen as cowards might be a sense of Tolkien correcting that decision that most of Beornorth's army made, or if that could be a connection.
Sure. I would say yes, I think it could be. I mean, it sounds plausible to me, and I'm thinking too of the, there's that fun article about the Bridge of Khazad-dûm as also a rewriting of the Battle of Maldon, in which what Gandalf does by refusing to give up the bridge is sort of what Beornoth ought to have done. And like all parallels, ultimately you can get it to break if you push on it hard enough, but it's also provocative, I think, especially in light of some of what Dr. Beitler was saying about kind of Gandalf seeming to have read Maldon when we get to the Black Gate.
I didn't know that exactly.
And so, so there is, I mean, this notion that these various reflexes of Maldon that appear in Tolkien's fiction are sort of aspirational rewritings, right? Like how could the story have gone better than it did? And I think that I would add that suggestion to a sort of very plausible stack of such rewritings. I hadn't thought of it myself. I'm glad you talked about the Black Gate because it was on my mind, but I thought I should limit myself to one parallel from the fiction. But I think it's an excellent comment.
I wanted to build on Sophie's question. First of all, a great journal for Anglo-Saxon studies would be called Overmode. Wouldn't that be a great title? I wonder how much this was personal for Tolkien and Lewis, having both fought in World War I. Tolkien said when I was an officer, I had too little courage and too much imagination. And later on, he says, the character I most identify with in Lord of the Rings is Faramir, except I don't have his courage. And he seemed to have that on his mind personally, not just as a scholar of bravery versus cowardice, but I wonder if he was engaged with that topic. And Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis says the opposite. He says that Ransom, like many veterans, discovered that he had greater reserves of courage than he expected. So they've both been tested in very life and death situations, and I think that gives a vividness to their literary analysis. They're not just thinking as scholars, they're thinking as veterans.
Yes. I think that's quite likely true. And so intuitively, right, I would say yes. It's difficult just from what I have read, the letters and other things, to sort of piece together with any precision what that looks like. And so I am a little bit reluctant to speculate about what I think was going on in Tolkien's mind. But I suppose I would add two things that I wasn't able to talk about, but that I think are both very important in the discussion of sort of chivalry versus heroism and all that. Are, number one, the contrast between the leader and the subordinate. That this is a really important thing for Tolkien, that heroism in some ways is more easily displayed and it's less alloyed form by subordinates because they're bound by duty, whereas the leader has a different obligation because of the way his or her choices will affect those who are dependent. And that came out in some of the quotations. And so sort of the burden of command that you're describing in your question, I think that tracks. The other thing I would say is youth and age. And this is something he drops this right at the end of the Overmode essay and does not pursue it, where in one of those sort of disclaimers, of which he and apparently I are very fond, he says, of course this doesn't nearly exhaust the subject. I have not, for instance, commented on the sort of different role of chivalry in youth and age. And I was wondering as I was rereading The Two Towers, what Faramir says, it should have been me, but Boromir prevailed upon them, and because he was the elder and he let them go, that part of Boromir's problem is that, well, as the elder, he should be less prone to chivalry, and that Faramir is the younger, and yet they found themselves in this sort of awkward reversal. And so I think there's evidence that these considerations intersect with a lot of very personal issues. But I am most comfortable when I can sort of take a couple words from one text and put them next to a couple words from another and then say, these things seem to go together. And I find that very difficult to do, in part just because of lesser knowledge, but also the state of the evidence with Tolkien's experience of the war. Oh, the other thing I would add, though, sorry, very briefly, I think the copy of Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Reader, one copy that folks have that have Tolkien's notes in it, is 1911. So, 4 years before his commission. So he had read and annotated Maldon a few years before he was commissioned. And so, that, too, is an interesting fact to toss into that pod.
One more question, and then we'll go.
After many wonderful thematic questions, I had a kind of practical one about understanding the context of Maldon and how Tolkien is engaging with it. Because it's a fragment, and a lot of what it seems like Tolkien is engaging with is the ambiguity of what's condemned. Is it either a tactical error or a real serious spiritual flaw? Is there any suggestion that the poem in its full length might have addressed that ambiguity? And if so, how do you think that plays into Tolkien's engagement with it?
That's all you.
Well,
No, it's an excellent question. And a question I'm very happy to answer and one I'm very used to answering, because one of the things I always tell my students in any medieval studies related class is the evidence is bad. And the thing I will say most often in this class is, well, we don't know, but... we don't know, but... The usual thing that you will hear from scholars of the Old English poetic corpus is that we think that Maldon, is probably substantially complete. In other words, most of the story that's in there is there, and we're only missing bits and pieces at the beginning and the end. Now, we have no idea whether or not that's true. And in some ways, I think the field says that because the field has to, because the alternative is, well, we have no idea what this is about, and we can't say anything about it. And so, as I often sometimes say to my students, if you can't be with the books that you love the books you're with. And so it is with Maldon. Now, I will toss out. So that is, that tends to be my posture, right? Is that as somebody trained in the field that the sort of the themes of Maldon are palpable in the fragments that survive, despite what we have lost. One interesting detail that I will toss out there is that the Liber Eliensis, that notorious book, says that the battle lasted for 14 days, which is a significant span of time. Nowhere, the fragment that we have, the 300 odd lines that we have, nowhere close to that. Now, we don't know whether or not the Liber Eliensis is correct. And even if it is, maybe Maldon is sort of like a mini Iliad where it's a 10-year war, but we only get the sort of snapshot of what happens at the decisive moment, because that's what's most interesting to the poet. Tolkien does speculate that if we had the end of the poem, we would see the poet return to a discussion of this theme, but it's mere speculation. Even the fragmentary manuscripts destroyed in a fire in the 18th century, and so by the time medieval studies as a field takes shape, everybody's reading of Maldon is dependent on a couple of, century-plus old transcripts of this manuscript that burned to ashes, and so we're doing the best we can.
Thank you, Dr. Weber and Dr. Beitler. Thank you all for coming. Remember, tonight only, you get 20% off this book.
That's a good book.
So go to the reception desk on your way out. And then one final word, if there is a woman here named Bristol Beatley, I have your card. Am I reading the card right? Okay. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Jim, this is a great response.